The first thing people noticed wasn't the man. It was the dog. A large German shepherd sat quietly at his side, alert but calm, eyes moving slowly across the street, like it was reading a story no one else could see. The man held the leash loosely, not because the dog needed control, but because it was a habit formed over years of trust. They stood near a small roadside cafe, just another face in a city full of strangers. No one would have guessed that this quiet moment was about to turn into something that would change lives, expose corruption, and reveal a truth no one saw coming. The man didn't look dangerous. He wasn't loud or demanding. He wore simple clothes, slightly worn boots, and a jacket that looked like it had traveled more than most people ever would. His face carried the calm of someone who had learned long ago how to stay invisible. The German shepherd sat close, its body relaxed but ready, trained without being obvious to most people passing by. They were easy to ignore, and that's exactly why they were chosen. A police car slowed near the curb. Then another. The sound of tires on wet pavement broke the calm. 2 officers stepped out, their tone sharp before a single word was spoken. They scanned the area, not for danger, but for someone who wouldn't fight back. Their eyes landed on the quiet stranger and his dog. One of them smirked. The other adjusted his belt and walked closer, already talking louder than necessary. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask questions. It made statements. They asked for papers. Then they questioned why the man was standing there, why the dog looked too trained, why someone like him didn't seem to belong. People nearby slowed their steps, pretending not to stare while listening closely. The man responded calmly, politely, never raising his voice. He answered what he could and stayed silent when the questions crossed a line. That silence only made things worse. The officers circled him, using words that sounded official but felt personal. They joked with each other, laughed a little too loudly, and pushed boundaries just enough to see how far they could go. The German shepherd remained seated, ears twitching at every shift in tone. The dog's eyes never left the officers, not with aggression, but with focus. Anyone who truly understood working dogs would have noticed it immediately. These officers didn't. One of them nudged the dog's leash with his boot. Not hard, but enough. The dog didn't move. The man's hand tightened slightly, just for a moment, then relaxed again. He looked down at the dog and quietly said a single word. The German shepherd stayed still, as if carved from stone. That should have been a warning. Instead, it became a challenge. The crowd grew. Phones came out, held low at first, then higher. People whispered. Some felt uncomfortable, but stayed anyway, pulled in by the tension. Everyone could sense that this wasn't just a routine stop. This was about power, the kind that hides behind a badge and assumes no one will question it. The officers accused the man of loitering, then of resisting, even though he hadn't moved. They talked about taking the dog away, about fines, about spending the night in a cell to think things over. Still, the man didn't argue. His voice stayed steady, his words careful. He looked like someone who had learned that reacting too fast could cost you everything. But beneath that calm, something else existed. A discipline shaped by years most people could never imagine. A mind trained to read danger, measure distance, track movement, and wait. This wasn't fear keeping him quiet. It was control. One officer leaned in close, invading his space, trying to provoke a reaction. The man met his eyes briefly. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't anger. It was something colder and deeper, gone as quickly as it appeared. The officer stepped back without realizing why. The German shepherd's ears lifted slightly, sensing the shift. Still no movement. Still no sound. Someone in the crowd whispered that the dog looked like a military working dog. Another person shook their head. Nah, they said, just a pet. The officers laughed when they heard that. They joked about dogs in movies and how everyone wanted to be a hero these days. They had no idea how close to the truth they were. The man finally spoke again, asking calmly if he was being detained or free to go. The question caught them off guard. One officer hesitated. The other snapped back with a threat instead of an answer. That was the moment the air changed. Not visibly, not loudly, but something shifted, like the pause before a storm breaks. The German shepherd slowly stood up, not lunging, not barking, just standing. Perfect posture, perfect timing. The crowd fell silent. Even the traffic noise seemed to fade. The man placed one hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding it, steadying himself too. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but it carried. He repeated the question. The officers exchanged looks. Their confidence wavered, just a little. Something about this man wasn't adding up. The calm, the dog, the way he stood, balanced and ready without looking tense. The way his eyes kept track of everything at once. This wasn't how scared people behaved. None of them knew his name. None of them knew where he had been or what he had done before standing on that street. They didn't know about the years of service, the missions carried out in silence, the loyalty between a handler and a German shepherd forged under pressure most people would break under. They didn't know that the quiet stranger they were pushing wasn't just any man. And as a senior officer reached for his radio, calling for backup, the man finally made a decision, not to fight, not to run, but to stop letting others control the story. What happened next would expose more than corrupt cops. It would reveal the truth about the man they underestimated, the dog they ignored, and the moment power met discipline. And the city was about to learn a hard lesson about judging a stranger by his silence. The man took a slow breath, the kind that settles the body before the mind moves ahead. He gently shortened the leash, not as a warning, but as reassurance. The German shepherd responded instantly, shifting its weight just enough to be ready without appearing threatening. To anyone watching closely, it was clear this wasn't a random reaction. It was communication without words, built on trust and repetition. The officers spoke into the radio in low voices, stepping a few feet away, but never fully turning their backs. Backup was on the way. That fact alone changed the mood. The crowd sensed it too. Some people stepped back, unsure if they should stay or leave. Others leaned in closer, pulled by the feeling that something important was unfolding. Phones continued recording, hands steady despite the tension. The man glanced around briefly, taking the exits, the angles, the faces. Not because he planned to escape, but because awareness was second nature. He noticed a nervous shop owner at the cafe doorway, the teenager filming with shaky hands, the older man across the street who looked like he'd seen situations like this before. Every detail mattered, even now. The German shepherd's name was Max. The man didn't say it out loud, but he thought it. Max had been with him longer than anyone else, longer than most friendships last. They had trained together in places that didn't exist on maps, under conditions that stripped people down to who they really were. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a partner, a protector, and sometimes the only thing that kept the man grounded when memories got loud. The officers returned, their tone sharper, more formal now. They asked again where the man was from, what he was doing in the area, why he had a German shepherd trained like that. The questions were framed like procedure, but the intent felt personal. The man answered carefully, giving just enough without opening doors he didn't need to. He gave a name, a simple one. No titles, no explanations. One officer scoffed, muttering something about fake tough guys and stolen valor, though the man had never claimed anything at all. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and unfair. A few people in the crowd exchanged looks. Even they could sense the disconnect. This man wasn't pretending to be anything. If anything, he seemed determined not to be seen. A faint sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. Backup was getting closer. The officers straightened their posture, confidence returning as numbers promised support. The man noticed the shift immediately. Power often grows louder when it thinks it's about to be reinforced. As they waited, the man's mind drifted backward, not by choice but by habit. He remembered his first day of selection, standing in a line of men who all believed they were ready. He remembered learning how wrong that belief could be. He remembered Max as a young, energetic German shepherd, stubborn and smart, refusing to follow commands until trust was earned. They had grown together, tested each other, saved each other more times than anyone would ever know. None of that showed on his face now. All the crowd saw was a quiet man standing still, his hand resting lightly on his dog's back. But beneath that calm was a history built on discipline, loss, and responsibility. A life spent doing things that would never make headlines. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The officers began speaking louder again, making sure the crowd could hear. Words like suspicious behavior and public safety were thrown around loosely. The man recognized the tactic, controlled the narrative early, and most people believe it. He wondered how many times it had worked before. Max shifted slightly, sensing the change in tone. The man gave a subtle signal with his fingers, barely noticeable. Max relaxed again, eyes still alert. A woman in the crowd whispered to her friend that the dog looked calmer than the police. Her friend nodded. A patrol car pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. 2 more officers stepped out. One of them paused when he saw Max. His expression changed, just for a second. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. He took a closer look at the dog's stance, the way the leash was held, the man's posture. He didn't say anything, but he paid attention. The senior officer began explaining the situation, painting the man as uncooperative without saying it directly. The man listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that letting others talk often revealed more than arguing ever could. Max stayed by his side, steady and silent. The new officers asked for identification again. The man reached slowly into his jacket, announcing his movement clearly. He pulled out a worn wallet and handed over his ID. No rush, no hesitation. The officers examined it longer than necessary, whispering among themselves. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, just a man passing through. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. They started asking about the dog again, where it was trained, whether it was registered, whether it posed a threat. The man answered calmly, explaining that Max was certified, vaccinated, and under control. All true, still not enough. The officer who had paused earlier finally spoke, asking a quieter question. You military? It wasn't an accusation. It was curiosity mixed with caution. The man met his eyes briefly, then looked away. I was, he said. 2 words. Honest. Incomplete. The atmosphere shifted again. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The crowd leaned in. The officers straightened. One scoffed, clearly unconvinced. Another looked thoughtful. The man said nothing more. He had learned that details had weight, and once released, they couldn't be taken back. The sirens in the distance faded. No more backup was coming. This was it. This moment. The officers had to decide how far they wanted to push. The man had to decide how much of himself he was willing to reveal. Max let out a low, almost silent breath, leaning slightly against the man's leg. The man rested his hand on Max's head, grounding them both. Whatever happened next would change the direction of the day. Maybe more than that. The street felt smaller now, the air heavier. Everyone sensed that the truth was close, just beneath the surface, waiting for the wrong move or the right one. And as one officer raised his voice again, trying to assert control, the quiet stranger realized that staying invisible might no longer be an option. The man's words were simple, but they landed heavy. The officer froze for a split second, hand hovering near the leash before pulling back. The pause didn't go unnoticed. The crowd felt it like a hell breath. Even traffic seemed to slow, as if the street itself was listening. The senior officer tried to recover, straightening his shoulders and forcing a laugh that didn't quite sound right. He said something about procedure, about maintaining order, but his voice had lost its edge. Confidence, once cracked, was hard to rebuild. The man said nothing more. He didn't need to. Silence, used correctly, could speak louder than shouting. The quiet officer stepped slightly to the side, creating space without making it obvious. It was a small move, but meaningful. He was no longer standing fully behind his partner. He was watching both the man and the situation, weighing consequences. Years on the job had taught him that not every confrontation ended well, especially when ego got involved. Max remained steady, eyes moving calmly between the officers. The German shepherd's presence filled the space without any aggression. People in the crowd started noticing details they hadn't before. The controlled breathing, the relaxed tail, the way Max only reacted when the officers moved closer. This wasn't a dangerous animal. This was a disciplined one. The senior officer cleared his throat and spoke again, louder for the cameras now. He accused the man of being uncooperative. The accusation sounded hollow. The man had answered every question. The words were meant to shape perception, not describe reality. Someone in the crowd muttered that this didn't look right. Another nodded. The phone stayed raised. The officers knew they were being recorded, and it changed how far they could push, but not how badly some of them wanted to. The man felt the tension tighten, like a rope pulled too far. His thoughts stayed clear. He reminded himself where he was. This wasn't a battlefield. There were no clear enemies here, just people making choices. He had learned in the teams that the hardest moments weren't the loud ones. They were the quiet ones, where a single decision could shift everything. The senior officer turned toward Max again, gesturing sharply. "That dog needs to sit," he ordered, even though Max already was. It was a power move, nothing more. The man didn't respond. Max didn't move. The officer's face flushed. The quiet officer spoke up again, firmer this time. He suggested they de-escalate, maybe run a final check, and move on. The word de-escalate hung in the air like a challenge. The senior officer stared at him, jaw tight. For a moment, it looked like the argument might turn inward. Behind them, another patrol car slowly rolled past, then continued down the street without stopping. No backup, no reinforcement. Just this group, this moment, and the eyes of the public. The man noticed a small detail then. A patch on the senior officer's uniform was slightly crooked. It was insignificant, but it reminded him that everyone here was human, flawed, capable of making mistakes. Some mistakes carried more weight than others. A memory surfaced uninvited. A briefing room, dimly lit. A commander explaining how small actions could lead to big consequences. How the wrong call, made for the wrong reason, could spiral beyond control. The man pushed the memory aside and stayed present. The senior officer took a step closer again, lowering his voice. He warned the man that things could get complicated if he didn't comply. The threat was vague by design. The man met his eyes calmly. "I am complying," he said quietly. The officer blinked, thrown off by the lack of fear in the man's voice. It wasn't defiance. It was certainty. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that something was about to tip. A woman near the back of the crowd called out, asking why they were still holding him if he'd done nothing wrong. Her voice was steady now, strengthened by numbers. Others murmured agreement. The energy shifted, subtle but real. The senior officer snapped back at the crowd, telling them to stay out of police business. His words came out sharper than intended. The quiet officer looked away, uncomfortable. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The man felt Max press slightly closer, not out of fear, but readiness. He rested his hand on the dog's back, grounding them both. He knew Max would follow any command instantly. That trust was absolute. It was also a responsibility he didn't take lightly. The officer's radio crackled again. This time, the sound seemed louder than it should have been. The senior officer listened, his expression changing as he processed whatever was being said. He glanced briefly at the crowd, then at the man, then at Max. The quiet officer noticed a change and narrowed his eyes. He asked a short question. The senior officer didn't answer immediately. The pause stretched. The man sensed it too. Something was happening behind the scenes. A name checked, a record flagged, or maybe just a supervisor asking why a routine stop was turning into a public scene. Whatever it was, it added pressure. The senior officer ended the call and slipped the radio back onto his shoulder. He looked less certain now, though he tried to hide it. He straightened up, clearing his throat again, buying time. Max lifted his head slightly, ears forward. The man didn't move. He waited. The street felt impossibly quiet. Even the crowd had gone still. Everyone knew they were close to something important, though no one could say exactly what. The senior officer opened his mouth to speak again, choosing his words carefully this time. The quiet officer shifted his stance, ready to step in if needed. The man remained calm, eyes steady, hand resting on the German shepherd who had stood beside him through worse than this. Whatever came next would decide how this ended, whether power doubled down or stepped back, whether truth stayed buried or pushed its way into the open. And as the officer took a breath to speak, the man realized that the moment he'd been trying to avoid was finally here. The line had been reached. The tension was at its peak. The next few seconds would change everything. The senior officer finally spoke, but before the words fully left his mouth, another voice cut in from the edge of the crowd. Calm, older, and carrying authority without volume. "Officer, that dog isn't a problem." Heads turned. A man stepped forward slowly, holding his phone down at his side instead of pointed up. He wasn't recording anymore. He was watching. He introduced himself simply, saying he trained working dogs for a living. Police dogs, military dogs, German shepherds just like Max. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't raise his voice. He just said what he saw, that the dog's posture, focus, and restraint were signs of advanced training, not something learned in a backyard or copied from the internet. The words landed harder than shouting ever could. The senior officer's jaw tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. The quiet officer's eyes flicked to Max again, then to the man at his side. The pieces were starting to form a picture none of them liked. The man with Max felt the weight of attention shift. This was the second thing he'd hoped wouldn't happen. The first was being noticed at all. The second was having someone else confirm what he'd been trying to keep invisible. He didn't thank the stranger. He didn't deny it either. He stayed still. The officer tried to regain control, dismissing the comment as opinion, but the damage was done. The crowd murmured again, louder now. The idea that this German shepherd might be a former military working dog changed how people saw everything. It wasn't just a police stop anymore. It was starting to look like something else. The quiet officer took a step closer to the senior one and spoke low, but the tension made it easy to read his lips. "We need to be careful." The senior officer didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed locked on the man. Then another unexpected sound broke through the air. A short, sharp bark. Not from Max. From a police dog inside one of the patrol cars. The animal had been silent until now. Max's ears turned instantly toward the sound, body reacting before thought. He didn't move forward. He didn't pull, but his focus sharpened, locked in. Anyone who understood dogs knew what that meant. Recognition. The handler of the police dog looked uneasy. He hadn't noticed Max before. Now he was watching closely. Dogs didn't lie. And police dogs reacted to things people missed. The man felt Max's muscles tense slightly under his hand. He gave a subtle signal, grounding him again. Max responded instantly, but his eyes never left the patrol car. The connection between them was obvious now, impossible to ignore. The senior officer took a step back, then another, not retreating, but recalculating. He asked the man again, quieter this time where he had trained. The shift in tone was noticeable, less aggressive, more cautious. The man hesitated, just long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable. He knew once he answered, there was no going back. Some doors closed for good when others opened. Before he could speak, a new patrol vehicle pulled up and parked farther down the street. Not rushing. No lights. A supervisor stepped out. His presence alone changed everything. Conversation stopped. Posture straightened. The supervisor scanned the scene slowly, taking the crowd, the phones, the officers, the German shepherd, and finally the man holding the leash. His eyes lingered there a moment longer than anywhere else. He'd seen enough streets and enough situations to know when something wasn't adding up. The senior officer moved quickly to explain, talking faster than before. The story sounded rehearsed, but rushed. The supervisor listened without interrupting, eyes drifting occasionally back to Max, then to the man's calm expression. The supervisor asked one simple question. Why are we still here? No one answered right away. The quiet officer finally spoke, choosing his words carefully. He mentioned the dog, the training, the lack of any real violation. He didn't accuse his partner, but he didn't protect him either. The line inside the badge had finally been crossed. The crowd sensed it. This wasn't just about corrupt cops anymore. It was about accountability, about which version of authority would stand, When everything was seen in the open, the supervisor turned to man. His tone was neutral, professional. He asked for the man's full name. The man gave it. Just a name. Nothing else. The supervisor nodded slowly, then stepped aside and spoke quietly into his phone. Not a radio. A phone. That detail didn't escape the man's notice. This wasn't routine. Max stayed perfectly still, eyes forward now, as if he understood that this moment mattered. The police dog in the car went silent. The senior officer wiped his brow, tension showing through cracks in his confidence. He glanced at the crowd, then at the supervisor, then at the man. For the first time, uncertainty showed clearly on his face. The supervisor ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked at the man again, longer this time, not with suspicion, with recognition. The man felt it in his gut. Whatever name had been checked, whatever connection had just been made, it was bigger than this street and bigger than these officers. The past he'd tried to leave behind had just knocked on the present. The supervisor opened his mouth to speak, and in that moment, everyone felt it. The second twist, the realization that the situation wasn't about a quiet stranger being bullied anymore. It was about how far the truth was willing to push its way into the light. The supervisor finally spoke, and his voice carried just enough to quiet the street. He said the man's name out loud, slowly, carefully, as if testing its weight. Then he added something that changed everything. He mentioned a unit. Not loudly, not for the cameras. Just enough for the officers to hear. The senior officer went still. The quiet officer's eyes widened just slightly. He didn't need more explanation. Anyone who'd spent time around law enforcement or the military knew what that unit meant. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. The word Navy SEAL passing from one person to the next like a spark catching dry ground. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment. Not in relief, not in pride, in resignation. The past had finally stepped into the light. The supervisor turned to the officers and asked them to step back. This time they did. No arguing. No attitude. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The senior officer tried to speak, to explain himself, but the supervisor held up a hand. Enough. He addressed the man again, this time with respect. He apologized. Not theatrically, not for the cameras. A direct apology for how the situation had been handled. He acknowledged that there had been no legal reason to detain him, no justification for escalating things, and no cause to threaten separating him from his German shepherd. The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, others nodded, feeling vindicated for staying. Phones zoomed in closer. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The supervisor then turned back to his officers. His tone changed. He reminded them that authority came with responsibility, and that abusing it didn't disappear just because a badge was involved. He told the senior officer to hand over his radio and keys. Right there, in front of everyone. The street went silent. The senior officer hesitated, disbelief written across his face. Then, slowly he complied. The sound of the radio being unclipped felt louder than it should have been. The quiet officer looked down, jaw tight, but said nothing. He knew this was necessary. The supervisor explained calmly that there had been prior complaints, patterns, incidents that hadn't been proven until now. The recordings, the witnesses, the choices made in public. This stop had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The man stood quietly through all of it, Max steady at his side. He didn't smile. He didn't look satisfied. This wasn't victory. It was closure he hadn't asked for. The supervisor turned back to him one last time and said he was free to go. He thanked him for his restraint, for not letting the situation turn into something worse. The man nodded once. As he turned to leave, the crowd parted instinctively. Some people clapped softly. Others simply watched in silence. A few called out words of support. The man didn't respond. He just walked, Max moving perfectly with him, leash still loose, trust unbroken. But just as it seemed like the moment was over, the supervisor spoke again. He asked the man if he'd be willing to stay a few minutes longer, not as a suspect, as a witness. The man stopped. This was the unexpected turn, the one no one saw coming. The supervisor explained that the investigation wouldn't end here, that this incident opened doors into deeper issues within the department, and that the man's testimony, combined with the footage and witnesses, could protect others from experiencing the same abuse of power. The man looked down at Max, then back at the supervisor. He thought about the life he'd built after service. Quiet, anonymous, safe. He thought about how hard he'd worked to leave that world behind. Then he thought about the woman who'd spoken up, the young man recording, the cafe owner watching from behind glass, the people who didn't have the training, the confidence, or the discipline to stand calmly when pushed. He nodded. The crowd murmured again, this time with something close to hope. As officers escorted the senior officer away, the quiet one remained behind, watching the man with something like respect in his eyes, maybe even gratitude. Not all lines were clear until someone showed where they were. The supervisor thanked the crowd and began dispersing them. The street slowly returned to motion. Cars passed. Conversations resumed. Life moved on. But the story didn't end there. As the man and Max waited, another officer approached quietly. He introduced himself as the handler of the police dog. He looked at Max with professional respect and said, almost to himself, "I knew it." The man gave a small, tired smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the street emptied, the man finally walked away. No cameras followed. No interviews were given. He disappeared back into the world the same way he'd entered it. Quietly, but the impact lingered. The footage would spread. Questions would be asked. Investigations would follow. Careers would change. And somewhere in the system, a line had been redrawn. The final twist wasn't that a Navy SEAL had stood up to corrupt cops. It was that he hadn't needed force, threats, or violence to do it. Just calm, discipline, a German shepherd trained to protect without aggression, and the courage to let the truth be seen.